He had 51% of the paper on the table and not a single step past the marble turnstile. The lobby had never felt smaller. Cameras from smartphones rose like a low tide. Voices stitched themselves into a murmur that smelled of lemon polish and curiosity. Men in suits circled the glass doors like a makeshift jury. Above them, on the mezzanine where the executive corridor became a theater box, Rogério stood with his arms folded, a grin that belonged more to someone who had rehearsed humiliation than to someone who had earned it. He was the kind of cousin who measured power in access badges and closed doors. Gustavo's cane tapped once on the tiles. It sounded absurdly loud. He was the chairman by law and by blood, the shareholder who had invested decades and a name into the company's bones. Yet security, those same faces who'd held doors for his anniversaries and waved at his charity dinners, blocked the way as if they had been given a new instruction to be obstinate. "No orders came through," said the head of security with the clipped politeness of a man who had learned to make power feel like policy. His name was Ferreira, and his mouth had recently learned to follow the path of a paycheck more than the path of conscience. From the mezzanine, Rogério called down, his voice broadcasted by confidence like a cheap speaker. "Maybe you should let the company breathe without you, cousin," he said. "We can vote without nostalgia." The crowd laughed. That laugh landed on Gustavo like a sleet of small stones. He had been carved by quieter battles. Long nights reading financial statements, nights with a swollen knee, mornings where a hand on the rail steadied him more than a staff meeting did. He had prepared for the long game, not for the spectacle of being turned away by men who had risen at Rogério's urging. Pride folded into something harder, a bone-deep humiliation that throbbed under his ribs. His fingers tightened on the cane until the knob whispered creaks. He looked up, trying to find a face that mattered. Helios, perhaps, the old lawyer who had lain awake across too many contracts. Celia, the nurse who'd taught him to breathe through a flare-up. But what he found was a sea of cameras and the flattening glare of lights. The company's logo glittered above the executive doors like an unblinking eye. And then Talita moved. She had not been hired for ceremony. To the world she was one of those invisible presences, the woman who reappeared from behind potted ferns to smooth out a coffee spill, the staff member who knew the names of every broom closet and every panic exit. But that was a convenience, a cover. Talita was the head of close protection by training, an experienced protector who had learned to disappear into uniforms and showrooms to be politely unseen until the moment she wasn't allowed to be. She wore the staff blouse that day, sleeves rolled, a name tag glinting under the lobby lights. Underneath was the thing that made Rogério's spectators feel safe: muscle, a harness coiled in her knapsack, a history of carrying people out of harm's way. Her hands smelled faintly of bleach and leather from the brief, necessary rituals of the morning. She moved with the economy of someone who had rehearsed restraint and strength in equal measure. "Gustavo," she said. Her voice was low enough that it cut through the crowd without adding to its volume. "Come with me." He blinked, the world focusing to the edge of her sleeve. There was an old familiarity in her steadiness. She'd been at his side for so long, sometimes as staff, sometimes as a presence he'd barely acknowledged. The pattern of being tended and then turned away had been part of their rhythm. He knew the shape of her jaw beneath the mask of quiet competence. She set the harness on his shoulders as if fitting a coat. It was not theatrical, it was practical. Velcros clicked. She checked buckles with a mechanic's economy of motion, the same way a pilot checks flaps. Around them the crowd leaned forward like a collective held breath. Cameras angled up, the glass of a smartphone catching the threaded light on Talita's braid. "Are you sure?" he asked. His voice was huskier than he liked. Pride had a way of asking for permission, then accepting it like a favor. "Don't choose courage for me, sir," she answered. "I trained for this." She hoisted him in a practiced lift. For a moment, the world narrowed to the arc of her forearms and the set of his jaw. Him, surprisingly light despite everything, and her holding the line. Then they moved toward the stairwell. The elevators, convenient, shiny, obedient, had already chosen the story Rogério wanted. They stalled at floors, opened on stale carpets, and closed. Technicians had been notified of a temporary glitch, a phrase that smelled of planning. The building's automated voice continued to offer polite apologies. It felt orchestrated. They took the stairs. Every step was a stanza in the public rewriting of a life. People did not always see staircases for what they were, thin, vertical theaters where resolve met gravity. The first flight up, Toleda's breathing was methodical. She set a pace that felt slow to the watching cameras, deliberate, dignified. Gustavo gripped her, knuckles whitening. The leather of his palm left a mark on her collarbone. A woman with a child in a carrier called out something, but it was indistinct, the kind of comment that meant, "Be careful," wrapped in a tingle of excitement. They climbed. Present, then, a beat for the climb itself. Toleda's calves burning with the precise ache of exertion, the harness biting into bone, the slick of sweat at her hairline. Gustavo's heart hammered in patterns she could feel through his sternum as she held him close to her chest. He smelled like soap and old paper, like the man who had built things and feared the ruin of them. The crowd followed them like a choral body. Phones recorded. Live streams began to pick up audio. The scrape of shoes, a breath swallowed, Rogério's laughter ricocheting from the mezzanine. You could see the geometry of their ascent in the reflections on the stairway glass. You could see the angle of exposure in the way the security cameras tilted their lenses. They reached the second landing. Toleda shifted her grip, letting the harness bear the weight for a moment while she flexed her arms. She had trained for endurance carries, simulations that sometimes used dummies that cried, and sometimes used people whose panic could make them heavier than their mass. She had learned to make the human load into a balanced endeavor. Move, rest, move. Rest, breathe, keep going. They climbed again. Halfway through the fourth flight, a hand on the banister scraped, and Toleda's finger slipped for a fraction. A small sound, metal on stone, stole Rogério's laughter and redistributed it into a chorus of sharp gasps. Gustavo's body lurched. For an instant, the world dilated. The faces around them blurred at the edges. The clack of heels and camera shutters became a roar, and the incline of the stair seemed to double. Her right hand slammed back onto the rail. She used the momentum, twisted, legs braced on the risers. Her forearm stung with an old friction she'd never told anyone about. Years ago, in another country, in a job that required carrying wounded on rubble, she'd learned to make sudden corrections without thinking. Training lived in her muscles. Reflexes were a kind of second oxygen. They did not fall. When they reached the sixth landing, a trickle of blood warmed Toleda's palm. She hadn't realized she'd nicked the side of her knee on an exposed bolt in the stairwell. The sting made her teeth part into a wince she would swallow into a smile for the cameras. Gustavo felt it. His hand failed away from the harness for a breath and then clung to her shoulder. He said, "Thank you," but his gratitude sounded like something attempting to outrun the weight of his own shame. They took the seventh flight. As they emerged into the corridor that opened onto the boardroom, the world turned into slow motion for a heartbeat. Plush carpet swallowed their shoes. The executive doors confronted them, engraved with the company's emblem. People in the room, board members, investors, a few media guests, held their breath like it was air they might lose. Rogério's face had become a shade you see in photographs of men whose confidence is an act, tight and glossy. Gustavo straightened, a small, dignified thing. He had been carried up 7 flights, and every eye in that building had watched the climb. He could feel the camera's heat on his back, the collective intake of the lobby somehow transported to this room. His voice found the room like a cut of light. "I'm here to cast my vote," he said. It was not loud, but it had the authority of a man who had chosen to make himself present despite the stare that had tried to make him absent. He stepped forward. His legs wavered, but he did not falter. Rogério's smile thinned. "We can proceed without theatrics, Gustavo," he said. "We're saving the company from nostalgia. We're modernizing." Around the table, alliances flexed. Some faces were blankly professional. Others wore the thin sheen of a person who had learned to pretend not to be moved by spectacle. Ferreira watched from the doorway. There was a tension in the set of his shoulders that had not been there when he had first denied access. Perhaps he was pleased that his choreography, if he had had one, had delivered public humiliation. Or perhaps he was beginning to see how public spectacle sometimes turned into the kind of heat that scorched the architects of the plan. Talita stood behind Gustavo with a steadiness that did not beg attention. She let the harness loosen. She felt the tremor in his body, more than from exertion, a tremor born of the raw animal sensation of being seen as diminished. Her fingers found the strap of the harness and flexed it, a small human anchor. There was an oddness in how the room received him. A part of the decorum demanded that votes be tallied without interruption, the machinery of governance ticking on. But the cameras, both the ones inside and the ones outside, had changed the context of that machinery. His arrival had turned legal fact into human drama. What he did next would not land solely in boardroom minutes. It would live on feeds, in headlines, in the hard, simple phrase, "He climbed." He moved to the chair that had been reserved for him. He signed the paper with a pen as if ceremony could mean unanimity. He looked up at the faces gathered, and for the first time that day allowed something like rage to shine in his eyes. "You're out of place in this room, Rogério," he said quietly. "Tonight the company votes with my shares. You have no right to." It happened the way conspiracies sometimes do, in a slip of a hand, in the misdirection of a smile that blocks an eyebrow, in a glass passed across a table like it was charity. The room's temperature felt different for a heartbeat, as if someone had tuned the lighting down by a degree. A board member, an old ally who had once been loyal, offered him a glass. He had come to the meeting carrying the measured exhaustion of someone who had fought for decades. He took it because politeness is a soft armor. The liquid tasted faintly medicinal, an odd metallic afternote on his tongue. His head bowed in an involuntary bob, like a plant giving itself to a storm. Talita noticed it the way a bodyguard notices small changes, a blink too long, a hand that no longer holds steady, the rearrangement of breath. She moved toward him with the practiced quickness of someone who had watched too many falls in training films. Half her mind catalogued the nearest exits. The other half catalogued responses: first aid, restraining, carry, conceal. But the plan had been patient. In the seconds it took Talita to bridge the gap, the room's choreography shifted. Ferreira's eyes met someone's across the table, and the nod that passed between them might have been a weather signal. Marta, the governess figure who had learned to move smoothly between care and control, was where no one expected her to be, behind the coffee cart, fingers wrapped around the handle. Her hands were as clean as the porcelain she manipulated. Her face was as neutral as a curtain. Gustavo's lids drooped. He tried to steady himself. Words attempted to climb out and collapsed halfway. The pen clattered to the carpet at his feet. His head fell against Talita's chest, and she realized with a cold, vertical certainty that he had been drugged. The room erupted into what a bystander might have called help. People reached in waves, but the help came with an undertow. Someone pressed his limp hand into a jacket pocket and found a folded paper. The jacket slid once like it was being arranged for a photograph. Phones flashed. A board member called someone in the hallway, an ambulance, his voice perfectly pitched to sound concerned. On the periphery, a recording device blinked. Talita reacted the way a professional does when the line between evil and legality is threaded with polite hands. She tried to carry him again, to move him toward the exit and away from whatever had been activated into motion by Rogério's smirk. But the surge of uniforms closed like a trap. Ferreira stepped forward, no longer just a man in charge of doors, but a man with instructions and loyalty that had been purchased or persuaded. He placed himself deliberately between Talita and the exit. "You can't take him like that," he said, and for the first time his voice carried that curious thing, a measure of obedience to the man at the mezzanine rather than to the law that should have served Gustavo. "You don't know what you've done," Talita said. Her words were clipped. She was not frightened, she was furious in a way that steadied her arms. The harness creaked as Gustavo's body slumped more deeply against her. She could feel the rhythm of his breath irregular as a damaged engine. Before anyone could secure him, Marta leaned forward, eyes cool. She instructed an assistant very quietly to fetch a legal form that had been prepared in advance, with signatures pre-inked if the light in Martinez's office had not been dimmed for privacy. The room's decorum dissolved into procedure. Someone called a doctor on staff. Someone else, with a pressured calm, announced a request for intervention on health grounds, an emergency evaluation that, when coupled with a prepared narrative, becomes a gate through which legal rights can be rerouted. Talita could feel the moment that would alter trajectories. Power is often a series of small adjustments that accumulate into a wall. Someone from the company took Gustavo's jewelry, watches that had rested against skin for years, a ring that had meant more to him than the metal itself, and placed them into a sealed bag. The official full faces stamped the bag with a label that said evidence, as if the act of sealing could turn humanity into a tick in a legal box. Talita wanted to refuse. She had been trained to obey lawful orders when in the interest of safety, but law was a mouth that could be turned. She kept her hands at Gustavo's side. The harness straps trembled under the weight of the moment. Outside the clinic, after they had gone through triage and formalities, things moved quickly and with a terrible efficiency. A social worker arrived. Pens scratched. Someone, perhaps Marta, perhaps a more distant actor, made the call to the court. A form began to circulate that would request temporary interdiction, alleging that the chairman was presently unable to manage his affairs due to a sudden onset of impairment. The word interdiction in their legal system was like lowering a gate across a road and saying, with legal paper and a judge's signature, that a man could not talk for himself. It was bureaucratic, final-seeming, and cruel in its utility. Talita watched a nurse, Celia, fold a blanket over Gustavo's shoulders with hands that looked like a contralto melody of care. Celia's eyes met Talita's for a moment, and there was a shared understanding. Medical aid and legal convenience sometimes walked the same hall. Celia's mouth said nothing, but her fingers tightened on the blanket to pass along a warmth that felt like a promise. And then, as if a stagehand had pulled on a rope, the world jolted again. Two plainclothes officers approached. They did not look at Talita with the recognition of someone who had saved lives. They looked at her with the kind of neutral friction people reserve for those they think might complicate their scripted day. One of them, an officer with a name that would later be put on a report, produced a photograph from an earlier signage meeting. His voice was polite when he asked for Talita's identification. "You're under suspicion of involvement in suspicious activities tonight," he said, the phrase chosen like a lid being dropped. "We need to ask you a few questions." Talita felt in the drop of that sentence the texture of being seen as the public consequence of a private loyalty. She had been the woman who carried him. Now she was the person who could be argued to have carried him into incapacity. By which logic was she guilty? The look on the officer's face suggested he wasn't here to decide logic. He was here to follow the path that had already been drawn. "You're making a mistake," Talita said. Her voice kept the steady register of training and calm, but it also held the hard edge of someone who had learned to name the thing before it swallowed them. She tried to produce her credentials, her protection ID, the paperwork that formally named her role within the company. The officer's hand was pragmatic. "Those'll be verified," he said. "For now, we're asking you to come with us." There are two ways an arrest looks. It can be a clumsy, raw thing, which is part pain and part shame, or it can look like choreography, surgical and sure. This one had the latter's sheen. They offered Talita a calm that tasted like compliance. They cuffed her hands behind her back, and the metal clicked. The sound was small, bright, and it meant a transfer of agency. Gustavo woke in the clinic with the ceiling lights swimming and a nurse at his side. He tried to speak, but his words tangled in a fog a paramedic called sedation. Through the glass that separated him from the corridor, he watched Talita being led away, hands bound, head high. The sight threw a knife into him that was at once private and public. He wanted to lunge, he wanted to speak, he wanted to be carried again up the same 7 flights and say, in the quiet of the stairwell, "No one takes her from me." Instead, he lay there with a pulse that felt both overwhelmed and stubborn. He was at once a man who had been humbled and one who had been placed behind a wall of polite words. Outside, Rogério's expression folded into a mask of serene purpose. He moved through halls with the practiced ease of a man who had decided on a narrative and then filled in the facts to match. The cameras caught him smiling at a journalist. His handshake was firm, his eyes politely untroubled. For Rogério, the spectacle had become a convenient instrument to wield. He had aimed to remove presence. He had instead turned it into a story that confirmed his power. But there were fractures in the neatness. Helio, thin, deliberate, the kind of lawyer who had lived long enough to have his astonishments measured, sat in the waiting area and watched with a face that refused to be calm. He had known Gustavo since the young man had first started signing papers with a fury that came from obsessive care. Helio's jaw worked. He had a way of letting decades of practice condense into a single, precise suspicion. He rose and did not go to the press. He had the kind of ethics that allowed him to live inside the law and still feel its meaning. He moved instead toward the nurse's station. He asked one question, low in particular. Was there a camera in the room? The nurse looked at him like someone who had been waiting for someone to ask. "We have a small security feed," she said, "but that feed is controlled. There's also an auxiliary clock camera in Mr. Ribeiro's suite that sometimes picks up the corridor. Why?" Helio did not answer the why. He put the small particular thought into motion. Evidence moves like a quiet animal. If you do not walk toward it, it may be trapped by someone else's hand. His mind was already making lists. Camera angles, who had motive to block access, who had signed medical forms. He had the slow, patient empathy of someone who knew that paper could be ordered. The truth often required a different kind of order, the stubborn sequence of chain of custody. Toleda's hands were cold inside the cuffs. The officer offered a bland explanation about procedure. He did not mention that he'd been called through channels that smelled like an inside job. He did not mention the subtle tilt that came when an ethical scale tips and a paper is placed over a person like a lid. When she asked for a call, her request was logged in Spanish legalese. When she asked for Helio's number, the officer glanced at Ferreira as if to ask whether that was permissible. "You'll be able to speak to counsel," he said, "once we verify." The words fell like a polite gate. Toleda had understood the arrangement from the moment she had tightened the harness. The thing that had begun as a courageous, public climb now unfolded into something that might be used to justify closing the gate altogether. As they led her out, the phones outside recorded the scene. The narrative was made of images. A woman in a staff blouse with a pair of cuffs that looked strange against the neat fabric. A chairman in a clinic bed. A cousin with the bearing of a man who had just finished a show. The cameras gave them surface. The internet would give them meaning. Toleda's mouth did not beg. She did not cry out in a way that would force attention for the wrong reason. She simply pulled inward, like someone whose next movement was to think. She knew, like a rhythm that had not been taught so much as found, that two things would have to happen now. Someone needed to find the small physics of evidence before it could be smoothed away, and someone needed to be spared the loneliness of a man who had been both carried and caged. As they escorted her past the clinic door, she caught Gustavo's eye through the glass. The look they exchanged did not need words to say what both understood. Justice is often a story told by those who have the leisure to write it. Tonight it would be written in a hurry by those who had decided that ownership and capacity were not necessarily the same thing. Toleda's throat tightened around an oath she hadn't planned to voice. She would not let the climb be for nothing. She was led into a plain room where the light did not care for drama. A clipboard was slid across a metal table, and she was asked questions that felt like a polite interrogation. Somewhere beyond the wall, the company's PR team fashioned a statement that would be sent to the press with a tone of tenderness. Sudden incapacitation was their phrase. There was a kind of cruelty in the gentleness. A young officer insisted she sit. Her wrists kept their memory of harness strain. Her fingers flexed until the cuffs left crescent marks. She thought about the way the chair's vinyl pressed to her thighs, and how, a few hours earlier, she had carried a man up 7 flights. The thought tasted of iron in her mouth. In the hallway outside, Helio walked with purpose. He had done what lawyers do. He had smelled a set of facts and decided they did not align. He made a call to a colleague who had access to small things, a security feed tucked behind the corridor decor, an old auxiliary camera in the executive suite that had a reputation for capturing the wrong angles because it had been installed by someone who liked to watch the world from the corner. He asked, quietly, for the files. There was a low, conspiratorial answer. "We can pull them, but chain of custody." Helio interrupted with a gentle but unyielding sentence. "Preserve everything. Don't delete a thing." Back in the interrogation room, Talita's training kept her mind sharp. She cataloged avenues of defense, but also avenues of attack. If they had wanted to remove Gustavo from power, they had chosen the most efficient public method: create incapacity. If they had wanted to discredit her, they had chosen the second most efficient method: frame the protector. The carrot of narrative was powerful. The stick was efficient. When the officer informed her she was under temporary detainment pending an inquiry into the circumstances of the chairman's health, Talita did not speak. She breathed, counting to 8 the way they had taught in combative meditations. Breathe in 4, hold 1, release 4. She thought of the staircase, each step a deliberate promise. She felt the ache in her knee where the stair had bitten skin. It hurt, but pain was an honest thing. She preferred its clarity to the slow, polite theft of power. "You'll have your chance to explain," the young officer said, "once the facts come in." Talita looked at him. "Facts can be manufactured," she said softly. "Proof is what holds them back." Somewhere far away, Rogério shook hands again and posed for photographs. He was a man who had learned to believe in the problem-solving power of optics. For him, the evening had the elegance of a puzzle completed. For those who had watched Gustavo climb, the spectacle had shifted into a question. What would a single brave action break, and what would it awaken? In the clinic, a nurse pressed a call button and a small camera, one of those corporate auxiliary feeds that usually recorded hallways for nothing more than safety compliance, pivoted under its casing and caught a slanted view. It caught Ferreira's profile, the tilt of Marta's chin, the soft, almost respectful way the doctor placed a blanket over Gustavo. It caught, too, someone from the board slipping a folded paper into a pocket at the edge of the frame. The camera did not know what it had seen. It was a small piece of glass recording an ordinary night arranged by men who thought their intentions could become law. Helio thought of that camera the way a man thinks of flint when he remembers fires. He wanted to make that grain of light into a narrative that would not be erased by paperwork. When they finally took Talita's fingerprints, the machine hummed and produced a stamped paper. She watched the numbers and the inked lines as if they were another barcode. She signed her name in a tidy line and did not add the word guardian. At the door, a small, polite woman who worked in switching told her, in a voice that was sympathetic but uncluttered by personal danger, that the best thing she could do was to insist on counsel. Talita understood the advice. She asked for Helio by name, and the woman wrote it down, even as her eyes shone with the knowledge of what could be done when the right names were passed around. Outside the room, a janitor pushed a cart down the corridor, his face worn with the patience of someone who had learned to be invisible and yet who watched more carefully than most. When they took Talita away in the patrol car, the city lights smeared like paint. She leaned against the window and let the world blur into motion. The weight of the night pressed against the glass like a hand. She thought again of Gustavo's face when he woke and found her absent. She thought about the climb and what it had been to heave an old, proud man up the stairs to prove a point. Her phone was in her pocket, and she had one tiny connection, a single number she had memorized because it felt like a talisman: Helio's. She had not spoken to him since the morning, and yet the embedded muscle memory of trust made her want to. But before she could pull the phone out, someone had taken it to log evidence. The irony of being disarmed of the device that could have proven your narrative was not lost on her. In the station, lights hummed. A cup of coffee sat half-drunk on a form labeled with the company's name. Someone had arranged things with careful hands. Talita had been carried, and now she was being carried in a different direction, into a process that disguised itself as neutrality. She thought about balance, about how justice required both weight and measure. She had seen men and women lifted out of fires and held while surgeons repaired and while lawyers argued, and she had the stubborn conviction that truth could be found if someone looked long enough. She sat with the cuff marks on her wrists, tasting a patience that was not resignation. The climb had not been performed for theatrics alone. It had been a visible refusal to be erased. Outside the station, Helio arrived at last, his steps measured like someone who had walked long corridors and always considered the knock before he made it. He had the small, particular look of a man who had found a loose thread and was ready to pull. He did not go to the press. He went to the clerk and asked, with the blunt clarity of someone who would not be turned, for copies of the intake logs, the names on the forms, the timestamps. "You're a minute late," the clerk said, as if the world operated on minutes and not on justice. Helio smiled in that odd way lawyers have, a smile that suggested he knew how to use minutes as a resource rather than as a cage. "What you have is good," he said, "but I will need the auxiliary tapes too. Full uncompressed files. If anyone tampers with them, we'll know." There was a beat where the clerk studied him. Then the clerk nodded, small and surprised, like someone who had not expected a man to ask for preservation rather than immediate disposal. Back at the clinic, the cameras kept rolling, because cameras always roll when a story is big enough to be interesting. The footage they captured would not, on its face, make a case. It would, however, be a knot of images that, when pulled, would either unravel or tighten. Gustavo slept in fits, waking to the sound of a voice that was not his and the feel of blankets tucked as if he were a patient and not the chairman. He dreamed of the stairwell, of the sheen of the banister, of Talita's forearms, and woke with a small, sharp regret that tasted like ash. He wanted to know what had happened between the seventh step and the doc's diagnosis. He wanted to know whether the same men who had prevented him from walking into a room had the right to decide for him now. Through the glass, he watched as Talita was led past by officers. She did not look at him. Instead, she looked straight ahead, as if the world between them had not been a corridor, but a challenge. He mouthed her name. The sound came out as a whisper, and the glass turned it into something uncertain. In the lobby, Rogério's party celebrated with the white-faced laughter of people who drink champagne to clean their hands of responsibility. He shook hands with a few people and was complimented on his decisive leadership. He was a man who had learned to measure triumph by how neatly his choices balanced into his narrative. He did not yet know the measure of the small cameras, of Helio's patience, of the way shadows sometimes come with a tiny filament of proof. The night tightened into preparation. Somewhere in the company's operations room, someone filed forms for interdiction, and a clerk stamped them with a force that made the action feel like law. In the clinic, a nurse signed a notation. The pieces clicked together into a mechanism that was efficient and bureaucratic. Talita, in a holding cell that smelled of disinfectant and old sweat, folded her hands over the crescent marks on her wrists and let a slow, deliberate calm come down like a bandage. The fluorescent light hummed an indifferent note. The benches were hard. The clock on the wall kept a pace that made patience into a visible, grinding thing. Her knee throbbed where the stair had bitten. The bruise was a private map of that ascent, every inch earned, every bruise an argument. Men in plain clothes passed the small window of the cell, their conversations falling into the metal framework of the building. From time to time, the door opened and someone asked the same list of neutral questions: name, occupation, relation to the patient. Each neutral question was an attempt to turn the evening's heat into official ink. Talita answered with the same precise economy she used in training. She had curried none of her lifelong habit of explanation. She had learned early that facts could be dressed into other forms if hands preferred to do so. Her thoughts, however, were already several moves ahead. Chain of custody, camera angles, timestamps. Who had been where, and who might still be willing to break the decorum to help. She counted these like breaths: 1, 2, 3. And in that counting she found strange comfort. Courage had turned out to be small arithmetic. Move, rest, move. Outside the cell, Helio did not pause for the press. He had learned a long time ago that desperation screamed louder than evidence, and that the work of truth was quieter. He moved instead through corridors papered with routine, intake logs, access badges, the thin, polite handwriting of men who signed forms to make difficulty look like care. He moved to the security room with the gait of a surgeon heading for an operating theater. The security room smelled of stale coffee and plastic, monitors arrayed like a bank of unblinking eyes. An operator, young and uneasy, fumbled with a mouse. Helio greeted him by name and, in the smallest, most disarming way, asked the question that matters. Preserve everything, raw files, all formats, no compression, no editing. The operator blinked. You mean everything? Yes, Helio said. Everything that caught tonight. Every hallway camera, every auxiliary feed. Save the originals, lock them, hash them, and call me the moment you have a copy. In digital forensics, hash is a form of fingerprint. It was detail enough that the operator knew he was being asked to hold the material with the respect a specimen is given in the lab. The operator did as he was told, and Helio followed the thread to people who knew how to make small things prove a truth. The janitor who had pushed a cart down the corridor and seen too much. The nurse who had lingered at a doorway. The clerk who stamped forms with a hand that trembled when ink went where it had not been asked. Celia, the nurse, had already been trying to do the smallest mercies she could. When she saw Helio in the bright corridor, her face unclenched in a way that felt like permission. She knew the look of a man who would do the slow, legal things to tilt a scale before it could be made to look neat. She led him to a quiet corner and said, "There's an auxiliary camera in Mr. Ribeiro's suite. It's tucked into the clock over the bed. Someone watches the feed sometimes for safety. She hesitated, then added in a voice low enough to be private, I kept the memory card. I put it aside because something felt wrong." Helio's hands, which had spent decades folding contracts and holding depositions, went steady. "Do you have it?" "It's with me," she said. "I couldn't say before. I was scared of things, but I think it recorded something." They were careful in the way people who cherish the law must be, patient and precise. Celia offered the card into Helio's palm with the ceremonial trust of handing a small, precious thing. He wrapped it in an envelope, wrote the time, and a note that said simply, "Preserve." Then he walked it to a trusted forensic expert he knew, Mariana, who worked out of a private lab and had the kind of meticulous thumbs that made digital objects speak. Mariana smelled of tea and focused attention. She set the card into a reader and watched lines of code as if they were pulse lines. She generated hashes, matched timestamps to server logs, cross-referenced hospital intake records with the building's elevator logs. The file names were small and utilitarian. The metadata, the invisible handprint that machines leave, was everything. It showed when the feed had been written, the times it had been accessed, and little telltale edits that forensic tools could either confirm or deny. "You'll have to be ready to show chain of custody in court," Mariana said quietly. "We'll export raw files, create authenticated copies, and I'll prepare a report. I can show you if there's any message of tampering. But you'll want more than the registry. You'll want witnesses who can say the files were untouched after these times." Helio nodded. "We'll have them." While the evidence was being secured, Toleda's night in the cell took on the grain of observation. Prisoners do not live in narrative, they live in particulars. A vending machine clanged somewhere, the hum of the fluorescent light made notes. She found a rhythm in small things, the worn seam of the bench, the scrape of boots down the hall. When the door opened and a lawyer's silhouette filled the rectangle, she understood that patience had bought her this hour. Helio took the seat opposite her, and for a long moment they simply looked at each other. He smelled like late-night coffee and the tobacco he'd given up years ago. His face had that tired accuracy of a man who keeps score in weeks, not in headlines. "We have the auxiliary feed," he said, "and the security feed. Mariana will authenticate them. We'll ask the court for emergency relief, temporary release on the basis that you've been detained in a process that looks like prejudice." Toleda's jaw tightened. "They can make the garden look like a prison very quickly," she said. "But I carried him up 7 flights. That is what the world saw." "What the world saw is important," Helio answered. "But in law, what matters is proof. We need to show motive, method, and means. We need to show that the glass they used to cage him was placed with premeditation." They worked the night into a compact of legal motion and practical action. Helio filed for emergency access to the files, submitted notarized affidavits from Celia, and requested the court to set a rapid preliminary hearing to consider her release. He argued that Toleda's detention was based on a narrative crafted to silence witnesses, and that the auxiliary footage was material evidence that must be preserved. He called in a favor with a magistrate who had a reputation for not being dazzled by surface order. The magistrate agreed to a limited review within 48 hours. In the meantime, the company's operations room became a pressure cooker. Rogério moved with the confidence of someone who believed the mechanics of public opinion were under his control. He had legal teams, PR teams, and the subtle advantage of allies who liked order and wanted some people kept in their small places. But there were strains in his apparatus. A few board members had watched the climb with the human part of themselves engaged, and their votes mattered in ways photogenic power often forgets. Small fissures widened into conversations behind closed doors. Ferreira, the head of security, was one of those fissures. He had followed orders, perhaps out of fear, perhaps out of the brittle loyalties that come with keeping a paycheck. Now the weight of that obedience pressed at his sternum. When Helio came to speak with him, there was a visible fight in the man's face. "I did as I was told," Ferreira said, "but I was there when they passed the glass. I didn't know." "You followed someone's plan," Helio said, "and now we need the specifics. Who did you take your orders from? When did the technicians report the elevator glitch? Which board member requested the emergency ambulances be on call?" Ferreira's voice was small in the curtained office. "It wasn't just one person," he admitted. "There were notes, a message from Marta, and," he swallowed, "I thought I was preventing a scene." "You prevented a scene and created a crime," Helio replied. "Tell me everything." When men who live inside systems start to speak, the system rustles. Ferreira told what he knew with the tiredness of someone whose moral ledger had been rasped. He gave names, times, copies of messages that showed coordination, not a spontaneous misstep, but an organized sequence. He gave the phone number of a technician who had been asked to time out the elevators. He gave the name of the board member who had delivered the medicine ostensibly to steady the chairman. The more he unknotted, the more visible the architecture of the plot became. At the hospital, Gustavo's world was narrower. Hospital ceiling tiles, the constant beep of monitoring equipment, the whisper of nurses. He woke slowly, a mind like a room that had been opened after dust had settled on the furniture. Pieces of the evening floated to him in fragments. A stair, a harness, Toleda's arms. When Helio visited him, there was a dignity in their exchange that had nothing to do with power and everything to do with care. "You were carried up 7 flights, Helio said, and someone thought that act would look like incapacity. We're going to show that they intended it. They orchestrated the meeting to frame you." Gustavo's fingers tightened around the sheet. "They took her," he said, voice a thin wire. "They took the woman who would not let me be erased." "You're not erased," Helio said, "and we have evidence. Don't let them speak for you yet." The evidence they gathered widened into a tight bouquet of proof. The auxiliary camera's raw footage showed the moment the glass of the boardroom was passed. It showed a hand, a wrist tipping a bottle. It showed an assistant folding a paper and slipping it into a pocket. The security feed matched elevator logs that showed the supposed glitch was preceded by a text message to a technician. Phone records placed certain board members in conversation with the same technician 30 minutes before the meeting. Medical notes recorded a medicine with a name that would be flagged by a pharmacologist as incongruent with the claimed diagnosis. Mariana's report, dry, exhaustive, and presented with the calm of someone who treats data like scripture, laid out the hash values, the unbroken timestamps, and the lack of evidence of tampering. She explained, simply, that the files were raw and intact, and that the metadata placed the camera's gaze on the sequence that mattered. She also testified that when she had isolated the audio channel, she could hear, faint but distinct, an exchange in the corridor that matched the names and times Ferreira had given. The little things that stochastic machines keep would not be denied. When the court set the preliminary hearing, the world leaned forward. Reporters milled. Cameras arranged themselves like a constellation. Rogério's camp prepared their public line. A necessary response to sudden incapacity, they said, with the ineffable gentleness of people who intend to write their actions as benevolence. Toledo's lawyers and Helio prepared pages of authenticated files, witnesses, and the slow, precise argument that a detention founded on a narrative is unlawful if the narrative was engineered. The hearing room was a kind of theater where law tried to turn spectacle into process. Helio presented the auxiliary files to the clerk in a manner that obligated the court to respect the chain of custody. The judge, a woman who looked at the world with the disciplined patience of someone who had stacked many small facts into large outcomes, asked for demonstration. Mariana sat under oath and watched the screen as the clip played. When the frame showed Marta handling the coffee cart, the room sucked breath. When the clip replayed, slowed to focus on a hand muffling the bottle's label as a therapist might mute a camera's violins, Rogério's lawyer leaned forward with the practiced look of contradiction. Helio had prepared for this. He played the uncompressed file. The metadata marched across the bottom of the screen like a metronome. He showed how the elevator logs, the access points, and the timestamps all aligned. He asked Mariana to explain the hash values and their meaning. She did in her small, unornamented way, and when she described how the file had been preserved and not altered, the room took it in as if watching a lock click open. Rogério's face had been an exercise in controlled calm, but as the clip rolled and the audio picked up small, implicating exchanges, that calm began to crust. He whispered to his counsel. The counsel whispered to a man in the gallery. It was not evidence alone that changed the course of a case. Witnesses did too. Ferreira took the stand, the part of his redemption enacted in a thin, honest voice. He said he had obeyed orders but had been misled about their intent. Under cross-examination, he admitted the texts, the calls, the directive about the elevator timeout. He described the moment Marta had told him to keep things on schedule, and the way language had been used like oil to grease a plan. The admission was not theatrical, it was precise, and it mattered. Marta, when she was called, sat with a face like a mask. Her tone was muted when she spoke, patient and composed. But the video had captured gestures that contradicted the public tone she used. Folded papers, furtive glances. Under the gaze of the judge and the analysts, the room felt like a place where pretense could not sustain itself. The human things, the hesitation before a lie, the involuntary muscle that betrays guilt, began to register in small, undeniable ways. the court played the whole of the auxiliary footage in raw form. The sound filled the room in a way that did not allow spinning. In one clip, you could see someone, not an assistant, but a board member, lean in and speak to another in a way that matched a text message thread. In another frame, a hand tucked something into a pocket with the ease of repetition. When the judge watched the sequence that showed the glass being set and the bottle being poured, the movement was literal. The intention behind it was now visible to a public tribunal. On the basis of this preliminary evidence, the judge said after a long listening silence, there is sufficient probable cause to find that the actions taken that night were not purely care-driven, but may have been instructed to produce the appearance of incapacity. Temporary interdiction placed under those circumstances will be reviewed, and I am ordering an immediate halt to any further restrictions on Mr. Ribeiro's legal capacity until a fuller hearing is scheduled. Furthermore, I will grant a motion to review potential criminal charges should they be warranted. It was not a full exoneration, it was a judicial opening. Toledo was released on the condition that she would remain available for further investigation. The handcuffs left faint crescents on her wrists, but her shoulders, always steady, rose into a small, private smile that had the shape of someone who had been vindicated by work rather than by luck. Outside the courthouse, the cameras tried to turn relief into a posture. But the public, who had watched a climb and a fall, now watched a different kind of ascent, the ascent of truth from beneath the machinery of power. Headlines shifted from gentle euphemism to more cutting phrases. The internet, merciless and kind in equal parts, found in the footage a lyric it could not ignore. A bodyguard had carried the chairman up 7 flights, and the plan to make that act into evidence of weakness had been exposed. Rogério, who had measured his power in access badges and closed doors, found his domain beginning to dissolve. The board convened emergency sessions to contain the damage. A few members who had benefited from his maneuvers began to distance themselves, their loyalty like water retreating from a shore. Investigations began, led by prosecutors who were not beguiled by corporate polish. Indictments for fraud, obstruction of justice, and conspiracy were discussed in tones that suggested legality would soon do its work. Ferreira, once a man who allowed policy to become an instrument of personal survival, stood before a different choice. He testified, facing both anger and relief from witnesses. Under oath, he described the pressure that had bent his integrity, the small payments and lines of influence that had seemed, at the time, like the only pragmatic path. In the end, he cooperated. His testimony was one of the slender reasons justice could thread through bureaucracy. Toledo walked out of the courthouse into a narrow, bright day and found a presence on the sidewalk that took her breath. Gustavo stood there, leaning on his cane, but without the look of a man who had been erased. His eyes were clear, and when she saw him, the world committed itself to stillness. He had been released from the clinic's immediate shadow by the judge's order. Rehabilitation would be long, but the legal fog had thinned enough for him to be physically present. They did not speak immediately. When they moved toward one another, there was a private choreography. He reached for her hand and, an awkwardness, a tenderness, grasped it. His fingers closed around the small crescents on her skin with a softness that had not needed permission. "You carried me up 7 flights," he said. His voice was a small, astonished thing. "You carried me when they tried to make a prison out of a stair." "You nearly slipped," Toledo said, with the dry, exact humor of someone who had chosen to keep her heart armored. He tried to laugh, but the laugh caught and became a small sound of exertion. People around them watched, and for a beat it felt like being the subject of 100 soft lenses. Gustavo's grip on the cane shifted. He rested his weight, and then, of all things, stood taller. The climb had not only been a physical effort, it had changed the way a man wanted to move inside the world. The criminal process moved forward in the way that the legal system does when a case is clear enough to pursue. Rogério faced formal charges. His lawyers argued on his behalf with the meticulous skill of well-paid counsel. Their arguments were procedural, strategic, and predictable. But evidence has a way of being stubborn. When the prosecutor assembled the case, video, testimonies, text messages, security logs, it looked less like accusation and more like an accounting. Rogério's cries of innocence began to be met by the stubborn chorus of records. In a courtroom that would later be replayed in news clips, the main footage rolled. It was not dramatic cinema. It was the small, savage choreography of people who had thought themselves beyond exposure. Rogério's features, which had been formulas of performance, were plainly visible. The set of his jaw when answering questions, the flicker of his hand when asked to explain his presence near the coffee cart. Marta's composure slipped when she saw the part of the footage that had caught her hands folding the paper into a pocket. Ferreira's voice, steady but not heroically, explained how orders had come. Witnesses corroborated. The judge watched, taking the long view that the law permits. When the gavel came down on a temporary injunction that removed Rogério from his executive role pending full trial, the act was not celebratory. It was formal, the law's necessary cooling. There were arrests, yes, but they were clinical, carried out with the aim of preventing flight, not public circus. Rogério was led away with dignity removed, in the way only legal handcuffs can do, clean, efficient, and necessary. Talida's vindication did not make the night's scars vanish. She had been wrongly detained. The bruises on her knee would not simply evaporate. The medical notes recorded her injuries. The legal record took into account the physical requirements of her climb. Gustavo, as the legal machinery rewound to put things in order, was declared no longer subject to the interdiction placed in the night's heat. His legal capacity would be reviewed with the clarity that was long due. Once the immediate legal steps were secured, the company itself began to feel the quiet pressure of public interest. Investors demanded changes. Board members who had once preferred silence now recommended public commitments. A list of reforms was drafted: accessibility audits, transparent incident reporting, a review of security protocols to prevent the weaponization of care.
Talida's presence in the story made a kind of moral force that could not be ignored. If a system had crafted invisibility into utility, it would be forced to reckon with the dignity of the people who had been asked to be unseen. There were private reckonings too. Some executives resigned quietly. Others faced public censure. Marta was suspended pending full investigation. Ferreira, who had given evidence, faced an internal review and later resigned. His conscience and a settlement cleared some of the lingering legal questions, but left him with the knowledge that his obedience had been costly in human terms. The company agreed to fund an independent audit and to bring in a new board oversight committee to ensure that power was not a tool for personal victory. Gustavo's recovery was not cinematic in the way people sometimes expect. There were good days and bad days. The climb's physical imprint lasted. His joints reminded him that gravity and time are relentless teachers. But he worked, physiotherapy, speech sessions for the moments sedation had blurred. He learned to trust his legs again, not as a question of pride, but as an exercise of care. He listened more than he had before. Perhaps the climb had changed how he measured presence. One afternoon, in a quiet room that smelled of lemons and paper, he called Talida to his side and produced a small ring box. There were no cameras. They were not in a boardroom and did not need to be. He had no grand orations. Instead, he spoke in the language of gratitude. "You carried me," he said, "not just up a stair, but through the kind of humiliation I thought would be mine to bear. You gave me back presence. Will you stay? Not just as my protector, but as my partner?" It was more than a proposal. If it had the shape of one, it was an invitation to remake a life that had been almost scripted by power into a life chosen by two people. Talida's eyes were bright in a way that had nothing to do with spectacle. She had lived much of her life invisible as a practical skill. Now, invisibility no longer suited the contours of her heart. "Yes," she said, and the single word landed like something sweet and precise. Yes. Their marriage was not an explosion of champagne in boardrooms. It was a small gathering. Helio stood at one corner with a quiet smile. Celia pressed a hand to Gustavo's shoulder like family. Ferreira, in a gesture of accountability, stood on the edge and offered his apology in a way that was accepted but not excused. The company, as an institution, pledged funding for employee support programs, a new reporting hotline, mandatory ethics training, and structural changes to ensure accessibility on every floor. An independent oversight panel was created, headed by a respected woman from civil society. The changes were not instant, but they were real. Ramps were adjusted, signage improved, and the policy that had allowed an elevator to be timed for convenience was rewritten to be transparent and auditable. The legal tide moved on. Rogério stood trial and faced the accounting of choices he had made. The courts moved at their own speed. Punishment, if it came within the measured rhythm of legal certainty, not the swiftness of gossip. Some were convicted, others were disciplined. The public, which had watched the spectacle and then the courtroom, found a sense of justice that bore the weight of consequence rather than spectacle. There were quieter consequences as well. Talita, who had been trained to disappear, found herself visible in ways she had not intended. People wrote to her, sent messages of thanks. She was offered a formal role as head of security, no longer hidden behind the staff blouse, but recognized as a professional with authority and pay that matched her responsibility. She accepted with a clause: protections for those who did the work on the ground, regular audits to prevent the weaponization of care, and a commitment to hiring people for their skill rather than their invisibility. She wanted the company to be a place that built dignity into policy. Gustavo, for his part, worked to ensure the company's public commitments matched private practice. He insisted on transparency in executive compensation and on the creation of a worker advisory council. He wanted the climb to mean more than a political telling. He wanted it to reorganize the company's moral economy. Their life after the storm was not a fairy tale fex. There were nights when the climb's memory came back sharp, when the gestures of a man used to controlling outcomes had to be relearned with gentleness. He walked with a cane sometimes, other times he walked without it. They rebuilt a family life that was quieter than headlines, but fuller than power. There were small rituals: a cup of coffee in the morning, a call to Celia when a new policy was being drafted, a note from Helio about a deposition that read like a private joke. Publicly, the company changed its emblem by degrees. There was a banner campaign about dignity at work, a set of training programs rolled out to all floors. The legal settlements and the oversight board meant there was a new checking mechanism when someone tried to make policy into private power. Rogério's fall was not meant for gloating. He was a man of talent and terrible choices. He had believed that power could be consolidated through the art of making others small. The law brought costs he had not accounted for. Not only legal penalties, but the loss of standing, friends who had distanced themselves, the quiet humiliation of being a cautionary tale. The story of his rise and fall became, in the company's internal trainings, a case study: the hazards of conflating private ambition with corporate governance. Their life after the storm was not a fairy tale fix. There were nights when the climb's memory came back sharp, when the gestures of a man used to controlling outcomes had to be relearned with gentleness. He walked with a cane sometimes, other times he walked without it. They rebuilt a family life that was quieter than headlines, but fuller than power. There were small rituals: a cup of coffee in the morning, a call to Celia when a new policy was being drafted, a note from Helio about a deposition that read like a private joke. Publicly, the company changed its emblem by degrees. There was a banner campaign about dignity at work, a set of training programs rolled out to all floors. The legal settlements and the oversight board meant there was a new checking mechanism when someone tried to make policy into private power. Rogério's fall was not meant for gloating. He was a man of talent and terrible choices. He had believed that power could be consolidated through the art of making others small. The law brought costs he had not accounted for. Not only legal penalties, but the loss of standing, friends who had distanced themselves, the quiet humiliation of being a cautionary tale. The story of his rise and fall became, in the company's internal trainings, a case study:
the hazards of conflating private ambition with corporate governance. There were, inevitably, those who argued that the spectacle was only performative. Yet the stair, small and vertical and full of human labor, had become a public symbol. It had transformed into a test. When dignity is denied, someone must choose to carry it back. The choice was not heroic in terms of theatrical display. It was heroic in the work of being there. Years later, at a modest celebration for employees who had been part of the change, Gustavo stood and addressed a room of people who had the look of everyday courage. He spoke not as a man who wanted to be venerated, but as someone who had learned to measure leadership by the people who walk with him. "When someone chose to carry me," he said, voice steady, "she reminded me that leadership is not a right you own. It's a responsibility you earn every day." We rewrote some rules because it was right, but mostly because people like Talita taught us how the company should be. Talita, standing at his side, felt that the arc of the night had been exacting but true. From the humiliating turnstile, to the lion glass in a boardroom, to the courtroom where light had been let into corners, the thread had not broken. In a small ceremony that followed, they renewed a private vow to look after one another when the world tried to take the word present away. The epilogue was not a tidy rectangle, but a slow, honest painting. Talita led a security team that respected workers. Gustavo spent mornings in small meetings where he listened more than he spoke. Helio returned to his offices with new gray at his temples, but the same moral muscle. Celia continued to nurse, moving in the soft spaces between law and care. She would, for a long time, be the person who had put the card in a pocket and thereby altered a chain of events. The changes reached beyond the company's polished facade. Local groups used the case as an example of how systems can be reformed when evidence and courage meet. The city's accessibility campaigns referenced the stair as a symbol of the need to design workplaces that did not force people into invisible labor. Those small policy shifts, the kind that take time, made room for people who had once been unseen to be visible where it mattered. When the films and the press cycles dwindled, the human things remained. Talita still felt the ache in her knee on rainy days. Gustavo still paused sometimes when a door closed without welcome. They had been rearranged by events into a life where dignity mattered in the small, sustained gestures. Their love, born of a crisis, was not a romance of spectacle, but a careful tending. It had the shape of someone who brings you water when you need it and holds the harness when you need to climb. If there was a moral at all, it was not shoutable or simple. It lived in the quiet insistence that truth, when properly recorded and carefully pursued, can change the architecture of power. It lived in the idea that one brave act, one person refusing to let humiliation be the last sentence, can make a cascade that rewrites policy, law, and habit. And it lived in the fact that those who were meant to be invisible sometimes choose, precisely at the hour of visibility, to save a life. If this story moved you, and if you believe that courage and justice still matter in small, stubborn ways, take a moment to like and share your reaction. Tell us which moment surprised you most. They rebuilt in increments, always mindful of the long work of fairness. And in the spaces between public victory and private care, Talita and Gustavo found a life that, though not simple, was honest. The company added an outreach program for workers in precarious positions. There were scholarships and security training for those who wanted to rise. An annual audit ensured no one could weaponize care again. When Rogério left the building for the last time, escorted by lawyers and the quiet containment of a system set to do its duty, he did not find a crowd to mock him. He found the sober consequence of actions weighed by law and evidence. The punishment was not aimed at humiliation, but at restoring an equilibrium that had been disrupted. Talita watched it happen with a steady eye. She had no appetite for gloating. Justice, she knew, had to be measured. In the end, the story was less about a single theatrical climb and more about what followed. The patient work of proving intent, the small acts that preserve chain of custody, the long, slow legal arc that returned agency to the man who had been almost erased. It was about a woman who had been trained to be invisible, choosing, against the tide, to be seen. They kept a photograph on their mantle, a grainy frame captured from 100 phones, of Talita mid-stride on the stair, Gustavo in her arms, the line of their ascent a thin diagonal that the crowd had frozen into 1,000 reactions. Beneath it, a small plaque read simply, "They carried dignity back." If you want more stories like this, stories of ordinary courage, of justice pursued with patient, slow work, subscribe and join us for the next chapter of people who refuse to let power become an excuse for cruelty. Share this with someone who believes loyalty deserves to be honored.